minutes in, and I think we'll go ahead and get started here. For folks, I'm seeing a lot of familiar faces to the call, but for anyone who this is their first time joining the content interest group calls, I'm Matt Schultz. I'm from Grand Valley State University, and I co-chair the content interest group with Lauren Work from University of Virginia Library. And it looks like Lauren was able to hop on here with us. She's just getting back from some travels as well. Lauren, are you with us? Joining us. For folks who have not joined the content interest group calls, we are primarily in these conversations focusing on digital curation and digital preservation dimensions for different formats, different media types. So the way that we've structured the calls this year, we have been inviting in different experts, like the gentleman that we'll hear from here in just a minute, Greg, to talk with us a little bit about the work that they're doing with on some different content levels. And then we sort of jockey back and forth between those guest experts and some administrative calls. So last month was an administrative call. In June, we had Jefferson Bailey in from the Internet Archive to join us. Folks can hop over into the notes that were sent over if they want to grab the link to Jefferson's presentation. We had that recorded. We'll be recording Greg's presentation here today too. But Greg is Greg Wiedemann is the University Archivist at University of Albany at SUNY. And he's going to talk with us about large-scale image processing and preservation workflows. As we turn things over to Greg here on the call, I guess what I'll ask folks to do, how we typically run the presentations is we are asking folks to go ahead and mute their mics. We are going to be recording. Folks can pop open the chat. They're welcome to post questions to the chat. Greg, I'll leave it up to you. If you happen to see a question that you want to hit pause on and respond to, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we can save the questions towards the end. We typically try to leave about 10-15 minutes for some Q&A at the end of the presentation. So we can make sure to circle around any questions that find their way into the chat. There is a hand raising function on the calls. So we haven't seen anybody make use of that on previous presentation calls, but they're welcome to. And that would just be a point where we'd ask you, Greg, maybe just to pause and someone can unmute themselves and they can throw a question at Greg and he can respond. So before we dive in, do folks have any questions, logistic questions, questions about the content interest group? I will say just in the way of a couple of updates before we dive in here, we have, as we're heading into DigiPrez in October, folks will likely have seen on the program that we've got a Thursday lunch session, working session for the content interest group. So at 11:45 on Thursday the 18th. Folks who've been attending these calls, new folks who are interested in learning a little bit more about getting involved with the content interest group can join Lauren and I. We'll be at that lunch and we'll look forward to hearing from some feedback from people. We'll do some brainstorming about what we can do differently in the next round of the interest group. And then other than that, I think, yeah, let me go ahead and check our calendar here real quick and I'll make sure we know when our next call is in September. So I think we're probably around September 5th or September 12th. We'll shoot out reminders for our next content interest group call. With that, I think, Greg, I'll turn it over to you. If folks don't have any questions, anything from folks? No? Okay. So Greg, go ahead and you can grab the screen and you can dive in and we'll look forward to hearing what you've got to share.
Sure thing. Let me see. I think, that's why. Can you see some slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So bear with me. I'm not really used to talking into a screen, but hopefully this goes without a hitch. So I'm going to give an overview of our digital imaging workflow from a project I did about 2 years ago, and sort of talk about some of the practical decisions we made, why we made them, and what worked and what sort of didn't work that well. So first, an overview of photography, born digital photography at UAlbany. Our campus photographer started taking or digital images in 1999. And the useful thing to keep in mind is that our photographer is a state employee, and we're a public university. So the photographs themselves are public records. We don't have to worry about rights and things like that. They take care of those things on the front end. And we don't have to worry about purchasing these images or dealing with contracts and things. So that's takes a lot of that work out. And that's also things that, since they're public records, we can make them pretty publicly available pretty instantaneously. So there's two main periods in the history of photography on the campus. First was 99 to 2010, and they wrote a bunch of camera raw files to DVDs. And then 2012, there's a noticeable gap in between, and hopefully those gaps got in one of the two, we think, but probably not. They started using the SmugMug service. So there's a ualbanyphotos.com that you can check out, and that has, and they've uploaded photos to them since then. So this is some graphs I did to sort of document the growth in the first period, and they take a lot of images. They do up to 300 events a year on campus, and these document speakers and different ceremonies and things. And as you can see, and this aren't cumulative graphs either. So in 2005, they took about 20,000 images. So there's a lot of photographs, and it's growing, and there's probably even more than that in the decade since. So for this first period, we got a lot of discs in boxes that looked like this. So 4 boxes with 600, mostly DVDs, but some CDRs mixed in, 1.8 terabytes of data. And most of these are camera raw files that come right off the camera, like the Nikon or the Canon NEF or CR2. And what the photographer used to do is he would take the camera raws and edit them into the final published form, and that would be saved as a JPEG. And that's JPEG, that edited JPEG for each. So we would be used in campus publications for marketing and things like that. So those JPEGs were sort of the final product, but we would have a bunch of camera raw files, and maybe up to 300, as few as 10, and then 1 or 2 JPEGs that they actually use out of that set. So there is a lot of like redundancy. So one of the really useful things, we had no input into this workflow. They sort of did this by themselves, but it actually worked out really well, is that every job, every event was assigned a job number, and it was used as the root folder or folders on the disk, and it was also written on the disk, and it was also tracked in an Access database, which they used to manage what department was making the request for the event, what they were charged and things like that. But they also had a description of the event. There was a lot of abbreviations and things, but it was very useful, and also the date from that database too. So that has some really useful things in it. Previously, before I got to UAlbany, the department here had been trying to work on this problem. They had a student assistant about 20 hours a week manually selecting images, because you didn't really want to keep all of them, only really selection, and adding really detailed item level metadata to like who is in each photo, and uploading it to our Luna asset management system. And they only got to a very small percentage over a couple of years. So, and they were really not really keeping up with the overall growth rate. So that while it created some really high quality metadata and made those images really accessible, had some problems. So 2012 to the present, they use SmugMug. So this is this online web app service that the campus photographer, the digital media office subscribed to. And there was, 2 years ago, there was about 20,000 images. There's probably more now. And the photographer uploads all the photos that they use, or a selection of the photos that they take, as JPEGs with metadata that they enter, which is really useful. So, and it has all this directory structure. Like I said, you can check this out. It's ualbanyphotos.com, and which is pretty useful. And you can really, it looks really nice. It's responsive, and it also has tags and a description of that the photographer entered, and things like this, which if you're identifying a photo, there's these we always used to come across, like who are these people and what are they doing? But we were able to find out from this some really detailed information about what event it was and who the important people. So without this sort of metadata, it would be really impossible to describe these adequately from our perspective. So having that, it turned out to be a really useful part of the workflow to have that data. And it also has a public API. So the downside, we were a little worried at the start when we started approaching this, was that they were entering only metadata in SmugMug, so it wasn't in any other system, which was bad on the surface of it, but good because it's in one place and it has this public API, so we can download. This is just a sample from their docs, but all the description, essentially, we can download all the content of the images if we get that a user with the relevant permissions. So that's great. So outlining a little bit of the parameters of this project. Like I said, you couldn't really be manual because you weren't going to keep up with the pace. So it really needed to be automated and scale. We weren't going to be able to create detailed item level metadata naming everyone in the picture. They really have to describe themselves. Transparency we wanted to keep in mind. We're making actions upon all of these images, all of which could affect the final product. So we really wanted to be transparent to the user to what exactly we are doing with that. In some cases we were successful in this, in other cases we probably weren't. And also we wanted to prioritize access. We use these images for our reference all the time, and we wanted them to be publicly accessible pretty quickly. And since they're public records, it's pretty easy to put them up. There's no reason to necessarily restrict them. And we wanted to present them within our existing collection. So for that image of the Rockefeller Center, if the Rockefeller Institute, if you were looking for paper records of the Rockefeller Institute, you'd also see digital images in the same access system. So that was the idea. So the main tool I used for this was Python scripting. And that is really great because it has so many libraries that can combine data from bunch of different systems. So there's a request library that we can use to query the SmugMug API. The OS library, what it does is it loops through your file system. So all of your folder names and files, you can get all of those and turn them into text, dump them into CSVs, dump them into XML and things like that. Move and copy and edit files. And there's also subprocess, which you can, any command line tools, you can loop through all those files and run ImageMagick on them or TSK, which we use, and also back in Python and LXML. And prior to this project, most of my experience with Python was working with EAD. So I had my main go-to was Python and XML, and we'll see over the course of this why that was useful and why that was a little problematic as well. But that was sort of my experience, so I found LXML really useful. So for the DVDs, the biggest hurdle was getting them off of the actual disks. And we used our BitCurator forensic machine for this. And typically, the reason that you'd use forensic disk imaging is that you wanted all of the data to come off in its original environment and preserve that environment. That's actually not what we were trying to do here, since the images themselves were kind of artificial and there wasn't really that much context that was useful there, at least that we thought. But it turned out that there's a variety of different ISO file system formats on each of these disks, especially the older ones. So a lot of times you'd pop in a disk and the operating system wouldn't recognize it. And this was a bigger problem on Linux than it was on Windows, but we still had a lot of problems actually like just popping a disk and getting the files off of them. So running DD on them was the most efficient way to get all of the data off of the disk at scale. It was the most dependable. So we took 5 external disk drives, and this was probably easily the most successful part of the project, and I just hooked them up to our BitCurator machine, and I wrote this script, which I'll probably talk about way too much, but I'm really proud of it because it's the first time I figured out how to do something like this complex. And we could figure out how to eject the disk and run DD on it, and did this while loop that it would try to guess the disk's file size and then eject it. So in practice, basically all I had to do without touching the computer is to feed the disk into these drives, and when it was done imaging it, it would pop the disk out and I could just swap it out in my office. So over the course of a week or two, I can just, as I was doing other things, just swap in these disks in and out and image all of the data off of the DVDs, which was really useful. I know other places have used things like RIP stations and things that also have really successful work, but this was a really low budget, useful way to, that worked pretty well for us. So then you get this, so which is a pile of DD images that that's all the bits on each disk. And Windows can't read them. There's really not much you can do with them except use forensics tools to carve out all of the data. So like I said, we use TSK, which is the sleuth kit. So there's files within them. It's a forensic tool set that's part of BitCurator. It's an open source forensic tools for carving files off of disk images. So the two actual programs we use within TSK were Firewalk and ICAT. And we would take so that would pull all the files out of the disk images and compare it against the Firewalk output, which is the metadata in each file, to make sure we had all the images. And we actually did. So it was, again, it was still a problem reading all these different ISO formats. And these are sort of the stats. We got the vast majority of them, but random images would come out and it would have data attached to it, but they would be unreadable or corrupted, basically. And as you can see, batch 3 was the most problematic because it was the earliest one, and that was the one with all the CDRs mixed in. So that's why the image count is less and the percentage is less as well. And then we converted them all with image magic at the end because they were all camera raw files. You get situations like this where this either has 0 bytes or has bytes and it doesn't think it's a file. So it didn't really carve out these files perfectly, which was the main problem on that. So I'm going to talk a bit about like using appraisal in these workflows. And that's a lot of things when we talk about digital preservation we don't necessarily talk about. And in archives, basically there's an implicit instruction with assumption in digital preservation that you're keeping everything a lot of times. And in archives, that's really not the case. We get rid of a lot of things that are not permanent records we don't want to keep, that have PII or things like that. So we use appraisal to try to identify what's valuable about these materials and try to steward that and preserve that material at scale. And this is a time-limited project. We have other collections. So as much as it seems like it would be wonderful to go in and save all these images, there's actually other collections that we need to go in and save as well too. So we really need to set some parameters on this. And there was no set limits to the project, but it was understood that it was not going to take that long. And it took basically 2 months, the initial part. So it was pretty, we had some pretty narrow parameters. So we made some appraisal decisions to sort of fit that. One is to not retain the camera raw. So camera raw files are created by like high-end cameras, and they're not a great file format. They're proprietary. There's a bunch of different versions of them. It's an access barrier. You need special software to read them. And they're also not like the final product of the image. They're sort of the environment of the photograph. So any photographer would have to edit it and control the lighting and what's going on in the image to get that final product. And so we sort of treated that as the sort of active record, and the inactive record would be the actual image on top of it. So the JPEGs they made after the images. Then we made the decision to convert all of the camera raws to JPEGs, which is something that you probably won't often hear in digital preservation. When I talked about this in the essay at SAA, there was a person in the front row like literally shaking their head like back and forth, like don't do that. So I'll talk a bit about why we made that decision. And as you can see, we got rid of a lot of data during that process. And the bigger problem that I think the thing that we had to make that was probably a bigger problem than the compression was not spending time recovering all the files. We did go back and recover some. Like there was an image set of John Lewis that came for an event on campus, and we only had 2 or 3 images out of that set. So we spent some time going back and trying to recover them and playing with ICAT and things. But there was diminishing returns. So it wasn't like there was 1 or 2 issues that would save all these images. You'd have to keep going and figure out what's wrong with this one and what's wrong with this one. So we made that decision as well. So JPEG compression. So there was a lot of practical reasons for this. One, all of the edited, finalized images that that were edited by the photographer were JPEGs already. So there's no reason to go back to the camera raw. So we're talking about here the unedited raws that were not used for anything. Those were the actual problem. And also all the images that we got from SmugMug post 2010, the photographer was always uploading in JPEGs. So, I mean, if we had to do this from the start and had control over their workflow, we might say, hey, maybe use a less lossy compression. And then finally, when we converted these at Bash with Image Magic, we did a lot of samplings, and JPEGs just looked the best because the camera raws, as I'll show you in a slide second, they're a bit darker because the lighting isn't controlled. So in this sort of shotgun batch conversion method, the JPEGs actually look the best. And also, I was talking about the purpose of the collection is to sort of document university events. So when we use archival appraisal, we try to identify what's the most useful part of the collection. And that's what we thought for this collection. Now, collection to collection, this will be totally different. If, for example, another extreme, if this was a collection of digital art, you'd never want to batch everything to JPEG because you're losing so much of what's valuable about that collection. In that case, you'd want to keep the camera raw. You'd want to keep any documentation about what the photographer was doing to the camera raw to get that final product, because that's what the value that you were getting out of that collection. And the other pragmatic thing is that users are really happy with JPEGs. A lot of times when we have uncompressed TIFFs, we just batch them to JPEGs and give users compressed images. And as long as the resolution is large enough, they generally, like, no one really minds the compression. And I guess the main thing I was saying is that JPEG compression is not a typical preservation strategy, but not using compression itself is not a preservation strategy. So compression, depending on your different types of compression, depending on your parameters of each individual project, can be useful or cannot be useful. So this is a very practical example. On the right here is the camera raw file, and on the left is a JPEG conversion. So it's actually, like I said, we couldn't go through all of these images and control for the lighting and everything. So we did this with ImageMagick for PNGs and a bunch of different formats, JPEG 2000s. And at the end of the day, the JPEGs just look the best. So that's what we want. We talk a lot about OAS and digital preservation, and that's another thing that we don't really talk about. OAS sort of implies that you're going to keep all of the data. So with this appraisal, where does this fit in with this OAS model? And so this is sort of what I think. I think you always have to sort of adapt OAS to your workflows itself. So I would think that the SIPs are the non-permanent DD images. I sort of went back and forth about this. In earlier versions, I called what I now think of as APE SIPs because we were keeping them. But I think the real decision is that we're not keeping our SIPs. These are all of the data that came off the disks and all those access database exports, where the APEs would be our sort of the things that we're keeping permanently, the process bags with all the metadata, and the DIPs would be the final product, which I'll show you at the end. So this is what our sort of SIPs APEs look like. Let's see if I can swap this screen to show you a practical example. Yeah, so like I said, this is just a bag. It's got the collection ID and then a UUID on it, and you have your manifests and your bag info file and things like that. Here's all the data, there's the ID, and these are all this is one batch. So these are all these job numbers, and then these are the actual JPEGs, but that were converted from the files. But we also have in here this XML file. And I'll show you here if I can swap again, if I pick the right screen. Hopefully that's an XML file. And so this is all of the metadata we thought that were useful during part of the project. We, who actually transferred it, we standardized some contact information, some sort of qualitative description about what we were doing. So each folder has an ID. Here's that job number right there. And then this is the description that came from the Access database. Also some timestamps from the curatorial events we took on these. We called them record events, which were the actual timestamps that were in the database, and try to describe them in a way. And we have, under this folder, we have each individual file with the EXIF datetime originals as well, timestamps too. So we sort of try to preserve these directory structures in this XML file. Now this was good because all this data is in here in a structured way, but also it wasn't as perfect as we thought at first, because the problem with this is that you have to build a parser to read all of this file, this data, and do something with it. So that was turned out to be problematic, as we'll see. So I'll go back to the slides here. Hopefully that went back to the slides. Yeah, so that's what our SIP/APEs look like, sort of at that stage. SmugMug, we wrote a crawler. So in Python, again, we used the request library to download all the images, and we saved there was hashes in the actual API, so we can both compare them to the images and store those hashes, so we can, when we go back to an Xcrawl, we can compare against what we already have. And we package them in the same bag structure with the same XML file, and pulling out that descriptive metadata as well. And then we had a separate script to write the metadata into our EAD files. And it broke. So there was two problems here. One was environment changes. Our computing environment changed and the Python libraries and things like that changed. And also they changed the API a bit. So we are going through two migrations. We're done with our archive space migration, and we're talking about in a bit, we're moving to Hyrax. So the plan is we stopped crawling SmugMug for the time being because the images are there as well. And we're going to go back and not create these sort of legacy bags and make our sort of new ape bags. But that shows the maintenance part of how that can be really problematic. So like I said, we want to put these up for immediate public access. So we listed all these DVD albums in a CSV file, and a student took all of these are the ones from all the DVDs, all of the description from the Access database, arranged them matching the SmugMug directory structure, which would eventually be ported into our EAD file, and described where there was a couple in that in-between period that didn't have job numbers. So we did have to do some description, but only for a smaller number. And then we had a separate Python script that, like I said, ported that directory structure into our EAD XML. Each image set or album or folder is a component with the DAO link. And then we batch generated static HTML files, which hosted all of these images and made them available on a web server. And then this was exposed in XTF as a finding aid. So this is what this looked like. And I can, it's the same screen. So I can just hopefully do this. Hopefully you should be able to see that. And this is our XTF finding aid. So this is the EAD, and you could go down, and then these are all these descriptions that came out of the Access database. And when you click on these DAO links for all these campus events, these are the static pages that were generated from the Python script. This is just an HTML file, and that's our archive space ID. So this is the description. It's not perfect. That came out of the Access database. And we also have some processing information here, the timestamps of what we did on each file. And over here is the date from the Access database for the album. And as you can see, I can't see because this thing is in the way. Yes, it says December 1st, 2001, but also we have so this is kind of interesting, the EXIF daytime original for all these images, and these images were actually taken on December 2nd. So the images, most of the time they're after, they updated the Access database after the event, but that sort of tells a little bit about the story of what these images were created. And you can sort through these, and it's responsive, and it works pretty well. The problem is you can sort of see is, again, maintenance. If you notice, the color is a little different because they changed the color scheme, and we haven't been making these in a while, because once we updated to archive space and the identifiers changed, these links that went back and forth went to our old ID system, and we have to edit all these HTML files, and there's thousands of them, to sort of change that. So there's some dead links. Some of them work and some of them do not. So we kept some of the old identifiers too, but we're maintaining 2 sets of thousands of HTML files. So that was sort of a long-term problem. I'm talking about the things I've learned as part of this process. One, it gets really complicated. Just because you can script all this in a Python script doesn't mean it's a long-term sustainable workflow. A lot of these things break over time. XML is really bad to put all these in. It can be useful, but there's no validation for it. So you can put inconsistent information here that when you try to build things on top of it, eventually becomes really problematic. So maintenance is an issue. So the thing we're trying to focus on now is infrastructure, and try to build things that we can maintain, that we can do these types of workflows on top of it. So as I said, we stopped crawling SmugMug for now. We did our archive space migration, so our archival description isn't in raw XML files anymore. It's in archive space, which is accessible from an API. And we're moving to, in the fall, ArcLight and Hyrax. So our archival description will be presented in ArcLight, and our content will all be presented in Hyrax, which also, they both have a public REST API backed by data model. So it has the validation built in, so we don't get any sort of messy metadata in them. We're also going to a new SIP ape model, and that's going to validate to something. It uses the same thing as a lot of what's in our XML files, but they're specified and as sort of like a data model is, and it's also validated against Baggett profiles, which is a useful thing that a couple of people are using. Nick Rouet started this, and I think they're using it at the Rockefeller Archive Center too, to validate their SIPs. So you can sort of see and to make sure the metadata that comes with your bag is consistent, and to validate against that spec, basically. So that can be really useful. So in the future, to try to enable these, because this workflow sort of worked in the short term, but had a lot of long-term maintenance issues. So to be able to do a lot of these big scale automated processes, we really need some sort of bedrocks. We need our systems that we can maintain, and we need them to be interoperable with our actual workflows. So essentially, if we have these sort of systems that we can interact with them through REST APIs, whether it's ArchiveSpace or Hyrax or ArcLight, we can build utilities on top of them. So eventually, hopefully, we can have a bag that gets validated according to a spec. And once we do our Python scripting, we can just post these things into these systems, and then we're only maintaining the systems and not the actual workflows of the Python script. So when your computing environment changes, you can have, everything doesn't sort of fall apart. And again, so all of our description will be held in ArchiveSpace, the content will be in Hyrax, and it will be accessible from ArcLight in the center. So that's hopefully what we're working towards in the next couple of months. And that was sort of the result of this. So thank you guys very much for having me talk about our imaging workflow. If you guys have any questions, please let me know.
Hey, Greg, that was fantastic. Yeah, we should open this up for questions. I'm sure several folks on the call have got some. I've got some for sure, but let's hear from folks on the call. Oh, come on now, people.
I have a question. Hi, Greg. I'm Paige. I'm at Boston College. Thanks again for this awesome presentation. It's really interesting to me that you guys are using like a content management system for like staff images, because our communications department is looking at using something called Portfolio Extensis or Extensis Portfolio. And so I'm a librarian, and our archivists don't want to accept all of the content that is, all of our staff are putting in Extensis, an extensive portfolio. It kind of seems to me like your workflow right now is to accept everything, but I was wondering if you had any feedback on how you could automate selection processes.
So for other types of material, it's a little easier because you can work with the text or some of the metadata. For images, it's really hard because you want to keep at least, ideally, some images from each of these events, but not all of them. Some of them have up to 300. So the best work I've seen is, I think I mentioned this at one point, Johns Hopkins, some of the archivists there were working with image hashing and trying to automate comparing images. And I don't know if they got that to work successfully or not, but for this situation, just pragmatically, yeah, we were keeping a lot of data unnecessarily, which is sort of contrary to what we try to do in archives. But just as a practical, the labor time that we would have needed to make these selections, it just wasn't worth it. It was just simpler to keep everything.
Yeah, especially if you're only saving, they're smaller files that you're saving, so it totally makes sense. We have one staff member in particular who will just take so many duplicate photos of people who barely moved their heads. So we're trying to.
Yeah, and also you can always deaccession these, hopefully, if you find a method that actually works later.
Yeah,
on.
That's true.
But generally, I think it's really good idea to keep these things in buckets. We see these with university records, and a lot of these systems are actually I was always sort of skeptical of them, but the ones that do have open APIs that you can get the data out in a structured way are really useful. So we have a wiki system on campus that we're using, and it's kind of useful because all of the campus offices enter all of the records in there and add descriptive metadata, but at least it's really useful to find what's a permanent record and what's coming to the archives and what's not. So in these sort of buckets, they can put things that we want to keep, and the stuff that we're not keeping is outside that bucket. So depending on how you can use them, sometimes it helps, but again, sometimes it's just more pragmatic to keep everything. So
yeah, awesome, thanks.
So Greg, we've got a question from Sarah Newhouse from Drexel in the chat. She says, I'm curious if you've had any feedback about delivering images via a finding aid instead of a more typical digital image repository, digital image collection.
So yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. It's not good. And that's sort of a problem, I think, with archives and finding aids. Not necessarily, like, I think it's good in the archival theory that allows us to present our content in, like I said, in that example, or even this example that's on the screen, if you can see it, is the New York State Writers Institute. So our paper collections about the New York State Writers Institute should be accessible in the same system as our images. So not having those silos is really great. The problem with it is that archival description is not presented in a usable way. So that's the thing we have to change. And the whole idea with finding aids is that they don't privilege delivery of content well enough. Yeah, so right now that's the drawback. It's a usability cost to doing that. And we have the system which we did a couple years ago, which is an XCF system, which is, I think, helpful in some ways, but it's still problematic in presenting this as this big, long scrolling image. So that's what we're hoping that ArcLight will help us out with and present our archival description in a more structured way that's also usable on separate pages. But there's a lot of work to be done on that front.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Questions from other folks? Well, Greg, I'm going to throw a question at you. I just want to say again, really, really impressive work that you're doing there, and I'm extremely curious where you have picked up all of your skills, all your expertise with working with Python, working with a lot of these different scripted approaches to dealing with your data. Did you pick that up through schooling? Did you pick that up through just sort of getting in the trenches and learning it as you need to? What's that story?
Yeah, trial and error over and over again. And I think it's important to keep in mind that I was playing with Python a lot. I worked at Marist College as an undergrad and also when I was in graduate school. So had some hands-on work working with EAD files there at least. And when I started here at UAlbany, I was in a project position, but I was still sort of given the freedom to experiment with our EAD workflows because I had an interest in it. So it not only, but basically I can't say enough how like failing over and over again really helps. And really trying to wall these things off. And it's not intellectually complicated in itself, but there's a lot of like environmental barriers to like environmental knowledge that you need to learn. I still have like, there's still areas that I find that, oh, I skipped that whole section that I need to learn now. But a lot of it's just sort of brute force trial and error. And that's sort of, I think, demonstrated in this project. And some of the things went really well, and some of the things I would do them differently now. But it's also important to keep in mind, like I said, I had a project position that allowed me some flexibility. And also being the university archivist here and having faculty status, a lot of things you can chalk up to research, which is a significant part of my job. So a lot of people don't have that flexibility. So having that, being able to take a couple hours during my day and experiment with something that's really, at the end of the day, really important to learning these things.
Mm-hmm. And I'll turn it back over to folks in just a second, but to piggyback on that, you're talking about having some time and some freedom to experiment. You've also touched a little bit on, sort of your systems there. And I think for a lot of, I know I can speak for my institution. I mean, access to systems and resources can be an uphill battle for a lot of institutions, or it can just be very complicated between their archives, their library, their central IT. Can you just sort of unpack a little bit for us what your resources are like there, and how that's helped, or what you'd like to see improved to take this even further?
Yeah, sure. So we have a library systems department, and there's I think there always seemed to be a person down, but there are 4 to 5 people in there. So that we have a database person, we have a web developer, but that focuses mostly on the library website, our Drupal site, and we have a sysadmin who's I work with the most in getting these systems up and running. And we have our department here we have the advantage of having a really great department here. There's four of us permanently and one on soft money. But in addition to me, we have a curator of digital collections that has a lot of good experience too. So we develop a lot more, I think, as an archives than that's typically done. And it is a slow barrier to getting sort of the time and the attention of our systems department, really. But we have other resources on campus. We have a lot of technical resources on campus. We have a data center on campus that can just give us servers, which is a tremendous asset, essentially for free. They're not charging us, at least yet. But the main barrier is system in time and the learning time for our system into learning new technologies that they're not familiar with. So our major success in doing that is A, doing more ourselves, and B, with our Hyrax and ArcLight, the main backing for that, we got a big CLEAR grant that required it, basically. And that sort of got the cachet within the libraries that this is important, this is valuable. And if you don't sort of make some headway on this, the problem, I think, is that you struggle for more and more to demonstrate your value, and then you struggle more to get those resources at the end. So it can become a really bad cycle. So I think we've been lucky enough to make some strides, but it is a challenge. Hyrax and Sambera in particular is a really tricky system to implement and maintain. So we're doing well somewhat with it, and we're getting there. But it's also a skilling up within our department and also within our library systems department.
Yep. Great. Thank you.
Yeah, Greg, this is Lauren. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I've been struggling with the internet connection. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this presentation. This was great. And I hope, I know you have a lot of GitHub repositories and you have your own website. So I wanted to first encourage folks I'll put a link to Greg's website where he puts a lot of his presentations and other work. Because I know a lot of us probably want to go back through and look at all of those scripts and, everything that's available.
Script here, it's not very obvious that it's UAlbany Archives GitHub, and it's UA395, which is the collection.
Okay.
So all the scripts I talked about are in there, and there's
awesome.
nothing edited, unfortunately, but everything is in that repository, which isn't very obvious. So I should put that up.
Yeah, that would be great. Thanks very much. I also had a question about some of the things you talked about, particularly you probably maybe saw some of the chat about the role of appraisal. And as a librarian, I'm really interested in how we approach that, both here locally at UVA, but kind of as a whole, this kind of thinking through doing kind of digital appraisal or aspects of that, prior to us thinking about the role of digital preservation, or at least in concert with that. Could you talk a little bit? I know as an archivist, this is something that is kind of rolled into the work that you do of appraisal, but talk with, maybe how you work with folks about that. Here at UVA, I'm trying to take the approach of potentially doing something like a technical appraisal first to help folks kind of sort through the vast amounts of digital material. I know that's a concept that people have written about, but I'm really trying to implement, the kind of skill sets we have as preservationists to help folks who may or may not, you said at Albany, you guys are pretty dev forward, but a lot of places that's not necessarily the case. Like, could you talk about some small steps that we could take to help kind of create that kind of environment?
So yeah, I mean, appraisal is a really hard thing. It's one of those like continuous things that's always imperfect. And I think what sort of you're talking about is informing that appraisal by digital preservation, because that certainly should be taken into account. Like how, and that's a lot of things that archivists that might not be that familiar with the technology, we make a lot of practical decisions in appraisal. It's like what to try to really demonstrate that value. But if things are more easier to preserve or more difficult to preserve or costs X to preserve, that really needs to play and be a part of that conversation, I guess. So I think that is really important. How you can sort of impact that environment, I'm not sure. It is challenging. I've been very fortunate enough that we've been a very open-minded department here. And part of the reason we got that way is that we had some retirements and we're more of a lot of, not recent hires, but because I'm the most recent hire, but we don't have a lot of people that have been here for 30 years, those sort of situations. But and it is really hard to get people to sort of readjust and change their ways a bit. So I'm not sure exactly. Do you have any, is that cover roughly what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head. You know, I definitely didn't expect answers, but I think that what you spoke to, both the I'm trying to find things that can help impact in an incremental way to kind of show and give people the language or maybe the questions to ask when thinking about appraisal of these materials. I think, excuse me, maybe that's just as important as to start with, well, these are the kinds of questions that maybe we should be asking to begin with. And then from there, maybe folks don't need to know all the technical details as to why we need to ask those questions, but they should know they need to be asked, kind of thing. So that's kind of, you know, the way I'm coming at it right now. So yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing that really helps us with our appraisal here, there's a lot more people that are better, more experts and archivists at appraisal than I am, because a lot of the time we have since we're state institution, we have a state records retention schedule. So that's really my go-to for a lot of these things, and they outline in ways that are super helpful. And I would look to them even if I wasn't a state archivist and I wasn't necessarily bound to them, but as useful ways to talk, examples of language and things like that. Yeah, and that's really helpful. And that, like, one of these things is that some of the barriers we come up with is that, hey, there's a law, we have to keep all of this stuff forever.
Right. Yeah, I'll leave space. Do other folks have questions? I could keep going.
Well, we should, Greg, we should give you an opportunity as well. Do you have some questions for the folks on the content interest group? We've got a range of different institutions on the call here, different sizes, different scales, different focus.
Maybe, I guess if you guys are interested in these types of workflows, what are the biggest barriers, that if there's anything we haven't talked about, to doing these sort of projects at scale and like large scale digital preservation?
Yeah, great question.
I'll start if that helps. So I kind of touched on this a little bit, but so in my role as a digital preservation librarian, I very much want to be doing the type of workflow that Greg has demonstrated. Some of the barriers are people-based sometimes, resources. You know, I could certainly take the large chunk. We actually just got a communications office transfer. This seems to be a theme, I think, with a lot of universities. You know, UVA is also a public institution, so we got a large transfer of our university photographers collection. And similar to Greg's work, very lucky in that he was fairly organized in his file naming structure, and that we were able to, unfortunately, there was no public API for the Cumulus database that they used here at UVA, so we managed to wrestle some things out of the back end of that. But some of it's resourcing, process, workflow. We're just getting set up with Archivematica, so I've got all kinds of questions and work I need to do about how we want to structure our bags. I'm really interested, Greg, in looking a little bit more at your APE and the Bagot spec kind of work, because I'm really interested in setting up pipelines, you know, so getting things automated, or else, you know, this work is not sustainable. But I'm also just as interested in making sure that, because right now, I think the process would be kind of that same BitCurate environment, potentially Archivematica, and then for long-term storage and AP Trust, which is our distributed digital preservation repository. But I don't want to be just sending things through that I know on the front end should not all be going through and being stored. So you talked about compression, but it's also just the huge mass of things that maybe we shouldn't necessarily be taking in the first place. And that's a curatorial decision. So that's where you get that balance of, you know, the work that we're able to do technically, we could do, but we do need some decision making on that end. So that for me has been a little bit of a barrier so far, and I'm working on it, but it takes time.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. We're kind of I really like the size of our department, because there's only like 4 or 5 of us, and we can make a lot of our decisions along that level. So that's really useful. But the other thing is that we would have a problem with that. You mentioned like trying to get a lot of data out of the back end of a system, like right from the database or something like that. Like that would be a big barrier for us too. If we don't have direct access, that we need someone that's an SQL developer or whatever to get permission from an outside group to get that data and the technical expertise to go in and pull it out too. So
Right.
it can be a big challenge.
I wonder if there might be, this is Edward McCann at University of Missouri, I wonder if there might be a way, I'm not intimately familiar with Cumulus, but I'm pretty familiar with digital asset management systems. There could be a workaround where you export the metadata, actually embedded in the files and then extract it using a tool, EXIF tool.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
IPTC metadata is pretty handy stuff. And it's nice. I was wondering actually if you were stripping it from the image files or if it remained with those files as they went out.
So I think when in the image magic, I wouldn't bet on it preserving the EXIF stuff, which is something that I didn't think about, which is really useful, like important. It would be nice to keep that if possible. So the good thing about that is that they're always like that embedded metadata. It's always attached to the image. But the bad thing about it is that sometimes it doesn't always document like the context of creation, a lot of contextual stuff too that we also need. So it's always an important part though, and a really good fallback. And the one example I had is that comparing the dates in the database to the actual EXIF dates really tell us a lot about the story of these images.
Mm-hmm.
But also I think at the end of the day, it's really hard for users to get access to that. So we have to pull them out at some point to put them into a system that is accessible and allows access to the images too.
I didn't follow you. It's hard to get them out of what? Which?
It's harder for, we want that metadata that's embedded in the files to actually help the discovery of the materials. So eventually they should, in addition to being in that embedded in that file, they should be in our public access systems, and they should be in our wider systems as well. So I think we soon need to duplicate them, if not, at the very least.
Yeah, there is a problem, and it's been a long-standing kind of an issue, I think, with Adobe, whether or not they're supposed to be leaving metadata in, and especially things about copyright, but that's another issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've got time maybe for one more question from folks, and then Greg, if folks have some questions that they think of after the call, your email is included on the agenda and information that went out for today's call. Would you be open to answering a couple questions from folks if they had them?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and again, if you need any of this information, a lot of it's on our GitHub, or feel free at any time to email me. It's gwiedemann@albany.edu, and I'm going to be at SA next week too, if anyone's around too.
Oh, fantastic, yeah.
I'm always available if I can do something to help, always willing.
Great. So yeah, we definitely still have time for another question from folks if someone's got something.
Could I ask what was the target user when you started out? Did you do any research in terms of your user base?
That's a good question, man.
That is good. We did some like user testing on the system at the usability wise, but no, we didn't really keep it like an imaginary like target user. But I think generally, again, I think we
who are you thinking is going to use this? And
I mean, both internal campus users and in the hopefully in the future for events for marketing the past part of the university, and also outside users as well. So we get alumni and public users from the public in addition to our supporting our campus mission. So, but we haven't done more detailed targeting other than that.
Yeah, I'm sure your campus publications like to dip into this content, to pull things out for
Actually, that's what I'm wondering. There's a pretty good group of publication-related people who need images here, but they're looking for something. I think that's probably going to be a little different than this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They're just not used to looking for things this way.
Yeah.
And
So
pulling them down.
and part of that is I think there's an access system barrier there that's not that great. I think for what we see on campus, we see more, they want more recent like stock images, but that they use the UAlbany photo. That's the one main reason they went to using SmugMug, I think. Or they want to do like they do for the campus publication, like Throwback Thursdays things, and they want like stories of the university from like the 60s and for the 20s and things like that. So these are sort of in the 90s, they're not really being used for that yet, but I think we'll be much more prepared in the future when we want to mine the 90s for Throwback Thursdays and whenever that is.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, well, Greg, thanks again so much for taking time out and giving the presentation, and just really great stuff. I will applaud you too for. I mean, we could probably have another hour, or maybe nowadays maybe not as long, maybe half an hour. I think we're kind of reaching the point of maturity in the field where we're getting more comfortable with some of what you talked about in terms of making those hard decisions around. Using compressed files as your sort of new archival master. But from my perspective anyway, I appreciate you kind of sticking your neck out there and taking a stand, as an archivist on that issue. Folks, we will have our call in September on September 5th at 11. Just check the calendar for that. Folks, stay tuned. We'll have this recording wrapped up and sent out either later today or first thing tomorrow. And then we'll segue into next month's call, and it'll probably be an administrative call. But we'll look forward to seeing and chatting with everybody then. Okay.
Yeah, thanks again, Greg.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
So long.